Welcome to our next topic, which is Book 3, the Aromatic Compounds. Ideally, if you can print the book off Connect and fill it in as we go through this PowerPoint. Alternatively, if you don't have access to a printer, make some notes for now and we can sort out books when we get back into college. So let's take a look at what we're going to study in this first part of the aromatic compounds topic. We're going to begin by defining the term aromatic compounds. We're then going to go on to compare two different models for the structure of benzene. We'll then have a look at the evidence that was put forward for one of those models, and then take a look at how we name aromatic compounds when they are substituted. So we're going to start by looking at the development of the structure of benzene theory. So chemists were investigating chemicals way back in the 1800s, and one of the first pieces of information they'd often obtain is known as combustion analysis. This is where you burn the chemical and you collect the gases that it gives off. Using the information of the gases that are given off, they then calculate an empirical formula. So we're going to use this information here to calculate firstly the empirical formula for benzene, and then you've got the MR provided as well so that you can go on to calculate the molecular formula. What I'd like you to do is then think about a structure for benzene, but bearing in mind at the time the chemists didn't know that cyclic structures existed. So they were trying to come up with an appropriate structure, and you'll see from some of the ones that you think of that it was a very difficult idea. Pause the PowerPoint to do the calculation, and when you're ready, move on. Okay, so to do the calculation, we start off by putting our two elements in a ratio with each other, and we calculate the moles. Once we've got the moles, we divide through by the smallest. In this case, both of them are the same, and we end up with a 1-to-1 ratio that gives us an empirical formula of C1H1. We then take a look at the MR of the molecule and compare the empirical formula mass to the molecular mass. And we see that the molecular mass is 6 times bigger, so the actual formula, the molecular formula of benzene, is C6H6. Now I hope you took a minute to try and draw a structure, not cyclic, that would fit 6 carbons and 6 hydrogens. And perhaps you came up with something like this one, where we've got lots of double bonds present in the structure, or even a molecule with some double and some triple bonds. So these were the types of ideas that the chemists were coming up with as a proposed structure for benzene. In 1865, a scientist known as Kekulé came up with the following structure. Now, if we look at that structure today, what would we call that? Using the UPAC system, just take a minute and think how you would name that molecule. When you're ready, move on to the next slide to see the answer. So the correct name for this structure is cyclic. It's obviously a cyclic molecule. It's got 6 carbons, so we would include hex. It's got 3 double bonds, so we need to use triene, and then we need to number them where they are in relation to each other. So we end up with cyclohex 135 triene. The A there after the hex is an optional. You don't need to include it, but it's fine if you do. So take a few minutes now to click the link below to watch a video that gives you some of the background that led up to the development of ideas about the structure of benzene. You don't need to watch the whole video, just up to 5 minutes 15, and don't worry about the German right at the very beginning. The narration on the video is in English. When you've finished with the video, move on to the next slide. So we're on page 3 of the notes now, and we can see that aromatic refers to some or all of the carbon atoms being in a benzene ring. So what do we call carbon atoms that are joined together in a chain? We met this idea way back in basic concepts. We probably haven't used it a great deal up until now, but we do need to know what it means. Just take a moment to think and see if you can remember the term we use for carbon atoms in a chain. So you should have come up with aliphatic. This means that they are straight chains or branch chains, and it can also refer to cyclic molecules. Basically, aromatic molecules are not aliphatic, everything else is. Now, benzene is an actual molecule. It's not a homologous series. So the homologous series is called the arenes. Benzene is the simplest of the arenes. Benzene's molecular formula, as we've already worked out, is C6H6, which means it has a very simple empirical formula of C1H1. Now, benzene is typically drawn in one of two ways. Both of these structures mean that you've got benzene present, and you're welcome to use either of those structures when you're drawing molecules with benzene in. These are considered to be the structural formulae as well as the skeletal formulae. Typically, if a question asked you to draw a molecule using structural formulae that contained benzene, they mean the rest of the molecule. You would draw this type of structure for benzene and then use structural formulae for the rest of the molecule. Skeletal formulae, this is the one you would use, either of those two. Generally, if you're writing equations using benzene, the only other way you should draw it is using the molecular formula of C6H6. And that should only be used when there's no question as to what the structure will look like in the product. So when chemists proposed this structure for benzene, Kekulé came up with it, they then decided to try and prove it by going into the lab and carrying out some experiments. Now, from their work, there are three key pieces of evidence that you'll be expected to know. The first one we're going to look at is the bond lengths. Now, this is between the carbons. Now, if we look at carbon-to-carbon single bond length, they've been measured to be 154 picometers. To think about the double bond length, we need to consider how a double bond forms. Double bonds are formed by p orbitals overlapping side by side. When they overlap, they form the pi bond above and below the carbons. Now, to overlap sideways is quite difficult. There's not a lot of the orbital that ends up overlapping. So to maximize that, to get as strong a bond as possible, the two carbon atoms in the bond will move closer together. So when you measure a carbon-to-carbon double bond length, it's smaller. It's 133 rather than 154 picometers. This means that when we look at the structure of benzene, we should see an alternating pattern of some long and some short bonds. However, when they actually were able to measure the bond lengths in benzene, they found that all the carbon-to-carbon bond lengths were exactly the same. And look at the size, 140, right in between the typical single and double bond lengths. The next piece of evidence we're looking at is hydrogenating benzene, so adding hydrogen to the benzene, breaking those double bonds. Scientists studied the energy changes involved, so they measured the enthalpy change. Now, they started by thinking about a molecule they already knew, cyclohexene. Now, cyclohexene at the time was considered to be very similar to benzene because the Kekulé structure says basically cyclohexene has one double bond, benzene has three. That's the only difference. So they measured the enthalpy change when they hydrogenated cyclohexene. And they found the enthalpy change to be 120 kilojoules per mole of energy released. Remember, a negative enthalpy change means energy has been released. They then thought, well, if that's the energy released when one double bond is broken, then it must be twice as much for 2 double bonds and 3 times as much for 3 double bonds. So they came up with this theoretical value for hydrogenating a 3 double bond cyclic molecule, what they thought to be benzene. They then got into the lab and they actually measured the enthalpy of hydrogenation of benzene, and what they found was it came out less than expected. Now, 208 kilojoules per mole being released rather than 360 means some energy's gone missing. Not all the energy has been released that was expected. Now we can see that's the proportion of energy that's missing, and that energy must have been used for something. If it's not being released, it's because it's being used. So that energy has been absorbed during the process. Now, the only way that energy can have been absorbed is to break the bonds. So we have some extra energy being taken here to break the bonds in benzene, compared to the energy that was expected for if it was a cyclohextriene molecule. The final piece of evidence is looking at the reactivity of benzene. If Kekulé's structure was right, benzene's got 3 double bonds, and we know how to test for the presence of a carbon-to-carbon double bond. Pause for a minute while you write down the test. Okay, so the test for a carbon-to-carbon double bond is to add bromine water a little bit at a time. Bromine water is coloured, orange usually, and what we're looking for is that colour to disappear. The bromine water decolorizes. Now our test tubes there have got the saturated test tube, the molecule with no double bonds present, having turned orange because the bromine water has been added but not changed colour because it hasn't reacted. In the right hand test tube we've got molecules with double bonds present, and the double bonds have reacted with the bromine water, removing the colour. You can refer to this as orange to colourless or bromine water decolorizes. Now benzene's structure, according to Kekulé, has got 3 carbon-to-carbon double bonds, so it should decolorize the bromine water very easily. When the chemists tried this, they discovered it didn't. Nothing happens when you add bromine water to benzene. So, summarising those pieces of evidence, this is on page 3 in your notes. These are the things you need to know. The Kekulé structure was proven to be incorrect because the carbon-to-carbon bonds were all the same length instead of alternating long and short bonds. The enthalpy change of hydrogenation was less exothermic than expected. Now, it's important that you use the term less exothermic rather than just less. Okay, we've got to be clear here what we mean. And the final piece of evidence, benzene displayed a lack of reactivity. The evidence of that is it does not decolorize bromine water as expected. So now that we know that the Kekulé structure isn't the right one, we have to consider what is. So we have a look at our 6 carbons. We know that they're formed in a ring, and we know that each carbon has 1 hydrogen atom attached. Now, as carbon has 4 outer electrons, 3 are currently being used in bonding here, which means a 4th is still available. And that 4th electron is going to be in a p orbital. So each carbon in the ring has a p orbital with 1 electron in it. Now we know that when you get p orbitals on carbons that are next to each other, they'll typically overlap side by side. We studied that in alkenes, and we've seen a localized overlap over 2 carbons. Now here, every single carbon has a p orbital, and every single carbon is the same distance from the next carbon. So where we might expect just 2 carbon p orbitals to overlap normally, here, because they're all the same distance apart, they're all going to overlap with each other. So we end up with this area of overlap right around all 6 carbons. Now we call that a delocalized pi bond. Still a pi bond. Pi bonds form from p orbitals overlapping side by side, but it's delocalized because it's not just fixed over 2 carbons. So an alkene pi bond is a localized pi bond. Benzene's pi bond is delocalized. And as with all pi bonds, we've got an area both above and below the plane of the atoms. So the accepted structure for benzene these days is known as the delocalized ring structure. Bad news is you may be asked to draw this in the exam. So the diagram below is taken from an exam mark scheme. This is the simplest diagram that will ensure that you get the marks. Now, any diagram requires labels. Very important that you label it. So on the left-hand side, we can talk about those p orbitals on each carbon, and they're going to overlap sideways. On the right-hand side, we've now got this delocalized pi bond, known as a pi electron ring. That pi bond is then above and below the carbons. So these are the key things that you need to make sure you label as well as drawing correctly. Pause the PowerPoint for a few minutes while you copy that diagram into your notes on page 4. Now, because the p orbitals are all overlapping, that means they all need to sit in the same plane. They've all got to be next to each other. They can't be going off at different angles. And because of that, the only way that they can all be in the same plane is if benzene is completely flat. Now, the term that we use to refer to molecules being flat, you've met this term before back in your bonding and structure. The term is planar. Okay, the molecules are in the same plane, it's flat, so we call that planar. Have a look at the structure of benzene on the left there. Think about each carbon atom. It's got a single bond to another carbon on either side, and we've also got a single bond to a hydrogen. So think about the bond angle that you've got there between the carbons. The correct bond angle is 120 degrees, exactly the same as the carbons in an alkene pi bond. Okay, so we've got those similarities. So to describe the bonding, we've got a model answer here for you to write into your notes. We firstly would talk about the p orbitals overlapping side by side. Now, adjacent is another term. That means they're next to each other. So we've just got to be clear one way or another that we are saying the p orbitals are next to each other and they overlap and they form this delocalized, this spread out pi bond. Very important, it's over all 6 carbons. There are 6 electrons in that bond. Because you get the area of overlap above and below, a common mistake is to think there are 6 electrons in the top half and 6 in the bottom, making a total of 12. But each carbon only had 1 electron available in its p orbital. So we have 6 delocalized electrons in the pi bond. Don't forget there are other bonds in the molecule. They are sigma bonds, so your carbon-to-carbon single bonds and your carbon-to-hydrogen are all sigma bonds. As we said on the previous slide, the molecule is flat, we call that planar, and its bond angles are 120 degrees. This is a model answer, and it is a question that's typically not very well answered, so learn the model answer. Now, because of the delocalized ring, benzene has an added stability, and we saw this when we looked at breaking the bonds in the hydrogenation enthalpy measurement. That's the second piece of evidence that we looked at. When we tried to break the bonds in benzene, extra energy was used to break those bonds. Now, typically, carbon-to-carbon double bonds would undergo addition reactions, and in that double bond, it's the pi bond that reacts. Now, if the pi bond is going to react, but it requires more energy than expected, that means benzene becomes resistant to addition reactions. Addition reactions require the breaking of that pi bond. Benzene is resistant to that. Now, the question we've got here isn't in your notes, so you'll need to go onto the back of a page or a piece of paper. But this question is taken from the 2019 organic paper, paper 2. And if you look at the examiner's report, you'll see this was not a well answered question. So hopefully, while the notes are fresh in your mind, you can do a good answer for this. So I'll give you 5 minutes, pause the PowerPoint and take 5 minutes to try and draft an answer. It's 4 marks. Try and make sure that you're going to hit 4 mark points. When you've finished, come back and we'll go through the answer. Okay, so we've set our answer to that question out as a table, hopefully to give you a clear summary of the important points. You can see we've got Kekule's structure at the top there and the delocalized structure on the right. One of the commonest problems when marking this question was that a lot of students didn't say which structure they were drawing when they did a diagram. Now, it's up to you. You can use statements or diagrams or a bit of both for your answer, but your diagram must be labelled. So, the similarities are we have p orbitals that are overlapping side by side in both cases. Those p orbitals are forming a pi bond that appears both above and below the carbons. If you're doing a diagram, you must clearly identify your p orbitals first, and then the fact that they form this pi bond above the carbons and below. It's all one pi bond, not two separate ones. So don't put pi bonds, it's a pi bond. Now the differences were where the problems really arose when marking this question. Many students seem to feel that in the delocalized model you didn't have a pi bond anymore. They use lots of terms like pi ring and pi structure, and it sounded like they thought there wasn't a pi bond. So to look at the differences in the Kekule structure, we could say that there are 3 pi bonds as opposed to only 1 in the delocalized model, that the pi bonds are alternating every other pair of carbons, that the p orbitals are overlapping one way only, so they're not overlapping all around. Alternatively, the pi electrons are localized. Remember that key term that says they're fixed just over 2 carbons rather than spread out. Or you could say there are 2 electrons only in the pi bond. To draw a diagram, clearly identify that this is the Kekule model, and you would draw those pi bonds over those alternating areas. Not particularly complex diagram. Again, the biggest issue was it wasn't identified as a Kekule structure. For the delocalized model, we've now got something that contains a pi ring. All the p orbitals are overlapping rather than alternating. Pi electrons are spread all over the ring rather than only over 2 carbons. Or 6 electrons are present in the pi bond rather than 2. Now notice the word delocalized doesn't appear in that answer, and that's because it was in the question. So you didn't get credit for using a word that's already provided in the question. You had to explain the pi electrons are spread over the ring, that's why it's delocalized. In terms of a diagram, here we're just looking for this idea of a pi bond all around the 6 carbons above and below. And again, clearly identifying that this represents the delocalized model. Okay. Now we're expected to be able to name all of the compounds that contain functional groups we learn about on the course, and aromatic compounds are no exception. So there are some rules that we need to know. Firstly, certain groups are shown as prefixes in the name, so they go in front of the name benzene. So for example, If you had a small alkyl group, like a methyl for example, then the correct name would be methylbenzene. If you've got a very small functional group, so a halogen for example, then it becomes the halogen and then benzene. So bromine is bromobenzene, just like it would be in front of an alkane. A molecule that we're going to be looking at in terms of formation and mechanism is nitrobenzene. So we need to know that the nitro group, that's that NO2 in the formula, also goes in front of benzene. Now, if benzene is attached to a chain of carbons that contain another functional group, or it's attached to a chain of carbons that is more than 7 carbons long, then benzene is now considered to be a substituent. It's no longer the major functional group. Instead of benzene, we now call it phenyl. Okay, so we wouldn't put benzene in the name, we would use phenyl instead. And we've met phenyl before. We came across the molecule phenylethene in year 12. See if you can remember where we came across that and what it was for. Another example, this time with a chain of carbons longer than 7, would be 2-phenyl octane. Now this refers to, octane is a chain of 8 carbons. The 2 is which carbon has attached to the benzene. Okay, so it's a slightly branched substituent on the benzene, and we call it 2-phenyl to indicate that the first carbon isn't joined directly to the benzene. Now, in chemistry, one of the things we must have worked out by now is there's always an exception to pretty much every rule, and it's the same with the naming of aromatic compounds. There are a few molecules that you just need to know what they're called. They don't follow the rules. A common example that you will meet is benzoic acid. Okay, so benzoic acid is the simplest aromatic acid, and it's not got phenyl in front, it's just known as benzoic acid. So some molecules have more than one group attached to them, and here we now need to think about how we're going to name this to describe where those groups are, because there's 6 carbons around the benzene and groups can substitute at any position. So you might have a group on the first and the second carbon, it might be on the first and the third carbon. So when you're naming, you need to include that. As always, your groups are then listed alphabetically, making sure that the numbers are as small as possible. So try naming these 2 molecules below, pause the PowerPoint, and when you're ready, move on to the next slide. Okay, so first molecule, 2 alkyl groups. Now they are the same, they're both methyls, so we're going to use dimethyl here. So 1,4-dimethylbenzene. On the second one, we've got a functional group, that's the bromine, the methyl is not functional, so the bromine takes precedence and gets the smallest of the numbers. So this is going to be 1-bromo-2-methylbenzene. Have a go at a few more examples, looking back over the rules if you need the help. Once you've had a go at these on the back of a page, move on to the next slide to check your answers. Okay, so starting from the left, we've got 2 groups the same, just like the previous example that was dimethyl, but this time we've got 2 chlorines, so this is 1,4-dichlorobenzene. Now the next example has a carbon chain with a functional group. So this is where the benzene is going to be relegated to a phenyl group. So to name this, the functional group is obviously going to be the first substituted part of the molecule. That becomes carbon 1. The methyl group therefore is on carbon number 4. And the functional group is a ketone. So the correct name for this is going to be 4-methyl phenylethanone. I know you can't get ethanone on its own, it would be an aldehyde, not a ketone, but here this is joined to the benzene ring, now called phenyl, so it's an ethanone group. Next one, we're back to, again, another functional group and an alkyl group. So the functional group is the first of the carbons substituted, but this again is that one that we have to remember, doesn't follow the rules. A carboxylic acid group directly attached to benzene is benzoic acid. So we then have to add in the ethyl group, it's one carbon away, so 2-ethyl benzoic acid. Finally, our last molecule is an ester. Okay, we've got an ester functional group there. So we need to think about which side of it would have been the carboxylic acid and which side would have been the alcohol. And we should recognize that the carboxylic acid group was attached to the benzene and it's joined to an alcohol that is aliphatic. So the alcohol had 2 carbons, that makes it ethyl, and then because the other part of the ester was made from benzoic acid, it becomes benzoate. Just like any other ester, we end in O8. Okay, that's the end of the first part of the Aromatic Compounds booklet. You can check your progress with the learning outcomes on the front cover of your notes. If you've printed it off, go through and see if you want to tick one of those boxes to show your understanding. Don't forget that the textbook can give you some extra context and more information, so it's always worth reading through the textbook pages as well as going through the notes.